Ilia Topuria will dismantle Charles Oliveira.
Soy Ilia el Matador Topuria.
Topuria will be moving up to 155 pounds and will be vacating the featherweight titles. And he will face former lightweight champion and number 2 ranked Charles Oliveira for the vacant lightweight title.
His name is plastered across the UFC record books. You likely know the credentials by now. Most submissions and finishes in UFC history.
145, 155, 170, I don't care. I'm a fighter and I'm the best fighter in the world.
Ilia vs Oliveira has been announced for the main event of UFC 317, and although Charles Oliveira has been looking extremely good as of late, and although he is a former champion, I'm here to tell you that Ilia Topuria is not only going to beat Charles, but he's going to finish him as well. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also be sure to click that join button for exclusive channel perks. But anyways, let's get into it. When you look throughout the UFC, there's great fighters and then there's Ilia Topuria. Ilia has had an extremely successful career with the company thus far. Of course, he has a perfect 16-0 record, but his success goes further than that. When you look throughout all of his UFC fights with the company, he's been able to be extremely effective and extremely dominant. Either all of his wins have been by finish, by TKO or submission, or in the rare occasions that he did go to decision against Josh Emmett and against Yusuf Zalal, they were very dominant decision victories. So a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, how has Ilia Topuria been able to be so successful thus far? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is his boxing ability. Because when you watch Ilia Topuria fight out there, it's very clear that this guy is one of, if not the best boxers in the entire UFC. On the feet, Ilia does a tremendous job at fighting at range while also fighting extremely well in close. At range, Ilia does a nice job at popping out that jab on his opponent while also doing a really nice job at throwing leg kicks. But once Ilia is able to get on that inside, that's really where he goes to work, and that's really where he finds his finishes. As once he gets on the inside, he does a great job at putting combinations together and landing devastating KO punches. But the great thing about Ilia is once he's putting those combinations together, he doesn't only headhunt, he also does a great job at throwing body shots as well, which of course then opens up his opponent's head and he's able to find those devastating KO punches. As when you talk about some of his finishing sequences in the UFC thus far, that body shot has been a real weapon for him. When you look at his fight against Alexander Volkanovski, when you look at his fight against Max Holloway, when you look at some of his other KOs that he's had throughout his UFC career, that body shot constantly shows up on those finishing sequences, or at least throughout those fights. So I do think his boxing is a main reason for why Ilia has been able to be so successful thus far. But another reason for why I think Ilia has seen the level of success that he's had is due to his wrestling ability. Because a lot of people may forget at this point, but originally when Ilia was coming into the UFC, he was seen more as a jiu-jitsu practitioner. As on the ground, Ilia does a great job at finding advantageous positions over his opponents by getting top position, by getting full mount at times and going to work from there, but he also has a great ability to find submissions. As in the UFC and even prior to the UFC, Ilia has a decent amount of submission victories on his record. So I think the overall versatility that we see with Ilia Topuria, with his great boxing ability, with his great jiu-jitsu and wrestling ability, is a huge reason for why Ilia has been able to be so successful thus far. But the next question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why do I think Ilia Topuria is going to dismantle Charles Oliveira? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is Charles Oliveira's lack of head movement. Because when you watch Charles Oliveira fight out there, he obviously is a very good striker. He's had success against some of the UFC's best strikers, whether you talk about Justin Gaethje, whether you talk about Dustin Poirier, and others as well. So certainly Charles has the ability to compete with Ilia Topuria on the feet. But when you look at a lot of Charles's fights out there, he doesn't move his head whatsoever, and he's got dropped a bunch of times throughout his career for it. Whether you talk about getting dropped by Dustin Poirier, whether you talk about getting dropped twice by Justin Gaethje, whether you talk about getting dropped by Islam Makhachev, as well as others. And when you talk about Ilia Topuria compared to some of those those other guys that I just mentioned, if he's able to land clean on Charles, I don't think Charles is going to get knocked down. I think he's going to get knocked out. So I think Charles's lack of head movement is going to be very dangerous in this fight versus Ilia Topuria. But the next reason for why I think Ilia is going to not only beat Charles but also dominate him is due to his versatility and due to his wrestling. Because when you look at Charles's fight against Islam Makhachev, of course Islam was able to drop him on the feet, but as soon as he was able to drop him, he then submitted him. And I do think we could possibly see a similar thing in this fight against Ilia Topuria. Now, I don't think Ilia is going to want to take Charles to the ground right away when Charles is fresh and while he's not hurt. But if Ilia is able to land some of those boxing combos on Charles and he's able to drop him, I think there is a possibility at that point that Ilia jumps on top of Charles, looks for a submission, and possibly finds it. I do understand that Charles is definitely the best jiu-jitsu practitioner in the UFC, and he is a better jiu-jitsu practitioner than Ilia Topuria, but if Charles is hurt by getting knocked down in a split second, I do think Ilia is good enough at finding submissions and is good enough on the ground to submit Charles Oliveira, as crazy as that may sound. So overall, I do think there are a lot of paths to victory for Ilia Topuria. I think he can finish Charles on the feet with a KO, but I also think he could finish Charles on the ground via submission, or possibly even via ground and pound as well. But my official prediction for this matchup would be an Ilia Topuria KO in the second round. But of course, I guess only time will tell what does end up happening in this matchup. But assuming Ilia is able to get past Charles Oliveira, and assuming Ilia is able to become the lightweight champion, there are a lot of options for him going forward. Of course, there is that Islam Makhachev fight, which would appear to be the biggest fight the UFC could possibly put on, but with Islam moving to 170 pounds, it doesn't seem like that fight is going to be happening relatively soon. So outside of that matchup, Ilia also has a huge fight versus Paddy Pimblett. You could put him up against Dustin Poirier if Dustin gets past Max Holloway. Of course, the Justin Gaethje fight is there. Of course, the Arman Tsarukyan fight is there. And there's just a lot of matchups for Ilia Topuria at 155 pounds. But of course, me and all other MMA fans would hope down the line at a certain point that Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria does end up happening at 155 pounds. But overall, if I had to give my prediction for where I think Ilia Topuria's career is going to go, I do think it's going to be a very successful one. I think, as I said, he's going to beat Charles Oliveira, become the champion at lightweight, and I think going forward from there, I would favor him against essentially everybody he can go up against. I would favor him against Justin Gaethje. I would favor him against Dustin Poirier. I know Dustin said this is his last fight, but if he is able to get past Max Holloway, who knows, if he's offered a title shot, maybe he takes it versus Ilia Topuria, and of course, I would favor Ilia. I also do think I would favor Ilia over Arman, although I will say I think Arman is probably the toughest fight outside of Islam for Ilia at 155 pounds, but for the most part, I do think Ilia Topuria is going to beat a lot of the contenders from 155 pounds, and eventually, if he is able to beat a lot of guys at 155, and we'll see what happens with Islam at 170, if he's able to beat JDM, and if he's able to get the title at 170, who knows, maybe a little bit down the line, we will finally be able to see that fight between Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria. But of course, that's something that's way down the line. At this point, Ilia's next challenge will be up against Charles Oliveira, which should be a relatively difficult fight, but I will say I do think it's going to be a very exciting fight. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Ilia Topuria is going to be able to run through Charles Oliveira, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.